Welcome to a new episode of the Creative Industry Insight podcast. I'm your host, Bobby. Today, we welcome director and producer Jerry Rothwell to discuss his work on Apple TV's documentary series, The Enfield Poltergeist. In this episode, we'll take a deep dive into how Jerry crafted the documentary and the creative choices that he had to make. Please be warned, there are heavy spoilers in this episode. So let's jump into the conversation with Jerry. Hi, Jerry. Thank you for joining me today.
Hi, Robert. Good to be here.
We're here to talk about the Enfield Poltergeist, which has just come out on Apple TV. I know we're recording this after Halloween, so it's kind of made me feel a little bit less scared watching it. Even though it's like I'm not the biggest horror person, but I think I'll still watch it just out of intrigue and interest because there's always going to be chatter online and people would be talking about things that you kind of just like, I need to see what people are talking about and kind of maybe scratch that itch. But on top of that, it's also based on a very famous case here in London. So it's like another thing that you can't really take your eyes off because it's true.
Yeah, yeah. I guess if it's any comfort, I'm not a massive horror fan myself either. So I came at this sort of from obviously there are nods to the genre in it, but fundamentally it was coming at it from a documentary point of view.
We've already had a number of sort of, we could say, like fictionalizations of the
Sure.
case itself, because you've had the Conjuring 2, and then also you had the Catherine Tate and the other gentleman. He's a famous British actor's name that I can't. Rafe Spall, not Rafe, that's his son. Timothy Spall,
Timothy
sorry.
Spall in that, yeah.
In that, so
Sky series, yeah.
yeah, so we've kind of seen it in like, I guess maybe not over sensationalization of it. But I guess here you have the reenactments, but they're all done through lip syncing, which I have a question for later on. But I reckon we should just go back to the beginning. And how did this project come about, and what made you want to take it on?
So I think I remember age 15, the news of a poltergeist haunting a house in North London hitting the front page of the Daily Mail, sorry, Daily Mirror. And that kind of impact on that generation of teenagers, the idea that these events could happen in a sort of ordinary house, it wasn't in some kind of country mansion or dark castle in Scotland. It was, in a North London street. And then I don't think I thought much about it actually after that, after the case ended. And then a few years ago, myself and my producer both happened to hear a radio program in which it became clear that there were large numbers of tapes that had been made in the house. I think and then there were around 250 hours of tape recordings made by a psychic investigator, Maurice Gross, who'd spent about 18 months in this house in which these strange phenomena seemed to be happening. And what interested me about that was, you had all this kind of evidence and testimony. The tape recordings are two kinds of things. He sort of interviews people immediately after something's happened, but also he just lets the tape run. So you get an understanding of the kind of context of what's going on in the family, as well as occasionally a kind of knock or a crash or a scream. And it struck me fairly early on that, what would happen if we sort of rebuilt that house and inhabited it with these sounds and then worked with actors to lip sync these recordings. That felt to me like an interesting way of exploring ghosts, exploring things that are at the fringes of our perception, exploring things we don't understand, because sound is so ambiguous. Sound always kind of calls for images. It makes you can hear a sound, but you don't necessarily know it's from. It indicates movement, but you can't necessarily position it. And so you start to throw in images. And of course, as soon as you start to do that, the sound becomes unreliable as a source of evidence. So that was the conundrum I was interested in. And it felt, it's like the conundrum that's at the heart of all documentaries. What is true? How do we know the world? And this felt a great way to explore that with an audience.
It's amazing to think that something that happened so many years ago is still in the zeitgeist today. and people still discuss it, still talk about it, and you lived through that sort of phenomenon as well. And then going back to it must have been like a weird, not nostalgia sort of feel, but you kind of like took you back to that sort of time as like a younger kid reading about it. Must have sort of brought back those feelings like kind of creepiness, but then also maybe doubts, because sometimes like as an not audience, but as like the general public, when you see these certain phenomena happening or certain things happening, you kind of think, especially now with technology, how have they faked this? What's the visual effects? What's the gags that they've put in? But I guess with this being in the 70s, it's kind of like next to impossible to think like, how can somebody fake this? And especially an 11-year-old child, and moving cabinets, voices, and all of that, and the bangs. It's something that's just like, wow, like this is not necessarily true. Let me rephrase that. It's
But
like,
it could be true, I
it
think.
could be true, yeah. And you could be like,
Yeah.
this is the sort of first time you could think, is there like a spirit world? Is this like proof of a spirit world? Is it this? Is it that? There's so many sort of unanswered questions to what's happening. But then I guess as a general audience, as a general public, sorry, you forget that there's like a family involved in this. You forget that there's a family who are going through a really horrible, terrible time. But all we're thinking about is like the sort of paranormal aspect of it, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think in this series, like we didn't set about trying to prove the existence or not of the poltergeist. That wasn't in itself an investigation. It was an account of an investigation. It was an account of Maurice Gross's investigation into this. And I think what we wanted to do was to sway an audience between, belief and disbelief in order to sort of walk that line where you have to start thinking about this stuff. As you say, the 70s, I guess quite a lot of my films sort of have ended up being about the 70s. And I think it is probably that for all of us, the decade of our adolescence is kind of endlessly fascinating, because it's when you sort of become yourself, perhaps. And yeah, that the period is really important in it. This was a time when Hollywood was kind of in this peak period of great horror movies. The Exorcist had been released a couple of years before. A lot of the events at Enfield actually mirror things that happened in The Exorcist. And although the kids hadn't seen it, I know The Exorcist was in the zeitgeist because I remember it myself as someone that wasn't old enough to see it. Remember my sister being freaked out by it and telling stories from it. So yeah, and I also think kind of horror and the paranormal seems to get renewed interest at moments of sort of crisis in society. Maybe it's that the instability and fears that come with kind of economic crisis, cost of living crisis, wars, makes us seek out horror perhaps as a safe place to put and explore those fears. So I think that and I think the 70s was like that, and I think now it's a similar kind of time. So yeah, I think the period is really important. In the series, we didn't, I don't think you ever see, we don't reconstruct a paranormal event. It's all about the aftermath of it. Who saw what? Did they see it? What else might it have been? All of those kinds of questions. And above all, as you say, it's about the family at the heart of it and the psychological impact of this, of both the events themselves and the investigation, because their house became kind of open house for all the visitors to the poltergeist over the next 18 months, which ranged from Maurice and Guy, who were the key investigators in it, but also quantum physicists came because they were interested in potentially, was this proof of the quantum world. Obviously spirits, mediums, and priests, and just ghost watchers. There was a huge kind of, and obviously the media, there was a huge interest, which meant that their lives became very public, and that had an impact. And in a way, the series shifts from the first episode, which is very much about the witnessing of paranormal events, and by the time you get to the fourth, in a way, the story's been handed over to the people who are at the center of it and their take on it.
I think sometimes as well, like, because as audience members, we kind of watch these things, and I guess the same thing could be said about true crimes, like how we devour it so quickly, and we get fascinated by I guess, like, you kind of look at it as like we're blinders on, that we're also focused on with true crime, maybe like one serial killer. On here, we're focused on the sort of haunting aspect that you forget about the family. But then once you pivot around that, you kind of just get like oh, do you know what? This is actually was a really bad time for them. And
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah,
and go on, sorry.
I was going to say, yeah, I think there's people have referred to it as a horror documentary, and I think I found as from a directing point of view, a real contradiction in that was quite problematic, because what people expect out of a horror is, they expect the paranormal, spirit world, whereas at the same time there's someone who is at the heart of that, for whose real life experience it is, and it's how do you both honor that person's experience and kind of explore in a documentary way what may or may not have happened, and sort of deliver on this heightened kind of aspect of that stuff. I think Janet, who's at the center, is very fed up with the story being kind of overly heightened and overly sensationalized, and that's one of the things that's really impacted her life. So there's this tension there, which I don't think you have in directing a fiction, in a way, even if the fiction's based on reality. Everyone understands that the fiction needs to take liberties, but people think of documentary as claiming the truth, so we need to stick somewhere close to that.
And you mentioned something as well earlier on about sound, and a lot of the sort of bangs and clangs and whatnot happen off screen, which I think is a really good idea because it's not necessarily something's witnessed, but as an audience as well, you're kind of more not transferred. You're put into the whole situation as being following investigators at the time to finding out what these noises are, what's going on. And sound is like a really funny thing for humans because it feels like when you're walking at certain times, you can hear certain things. Did I hear that correctly? Even like at the dead of night, sometimes my family home's like a mile away from a train station, but sometimes you can hear them going on the tracks because of how sound could be carried. And that's like another thing that can really mess around with like people's psyche is like sound. It's like, did I hear that correctly? Is that correct? Oh my gosh, is this happening now?
And we wanted to sort of build that kind of sense of uncertainty in an audience in the film. In some ways, that is what's creepy about it, isn't it? It's the sort of like, if you knew what the sound was, it would be less creepy.
Yeah, if you knew that it was like whatever, a cup being placed onto a mat, then you'd be like, oh, okay. But when you're sitting there in the dark or somewhere else, and you hear it, you're like, oh, what could that be? Could that be a footstep? Oh my gosh, somebody's in my house. But on top of the documentary, there's the reenactments, and you build parts of the house, and it's really beautifully shown in the first episode where you see areas being built, and then the backdrop of it all, backdrop of the house gets put down, painted backdrop. Where did this idea come from, and why is it that you wanted to sort of tell the story this way?
So, and ending up with a series in which the soundtrack of the series fundamentally was archival and actuality, and the pictures were layers of interpretations on top of that. Our way of working with actors, our reconstruction of the house, felt like an interesting thing to do to an audience, where you're halfway between the real and the unreal. And it felt to me that it was good if an audience was conscious of that. I didn't want people in a way to meld into this as though it was a drama. I wanted to kind of keep them in that place where it was like half real, half unreal. Hence showing the set at times. We don't overdo it. I think it doesn't become too irritating, hopefully. But we, certainly at the start of each episode, we show the construction of it a couple of times in each episode, or maybe one or two times we pull out, and you can usually at a key moment where you are deeply immersed in something and we want to pull you out of it, we reveal the set. So that's why we took that approach.
I guess there's so many ways that you can tell a documentary, and as well, like you want to, even though everything's been built up on these recordings, you kind of want to bring people into that world as well, and really actually sort of get an understanding. And I think a scope of the house as well and geography of areas, because it's all well and good seeing floor plans as an audience member, but I guess it's better visually to see actually this is where the two beds were, this is where the cabinet was, this is where the stairs would be leading up to the house as well. Not house, sorry, leading up to the rooms on the next floor.
Yeah, and at times we bring contributors who were in the actual house into that house to use the reconstructed house to tell what happened. I mean, in a way, I wish I'd done that a little bit more actually, because I think it really worked. So I think it was one of those things that you weren't sure in the direct when we were planning it and thinking about how to direct it, whether that would just be too much, you know. But actually, I think it you know, looking back on it, it really works. Something that I would have liked to have done a bit more. We do it again, you know, a few times in the series, but might have been interesting to take some of the other contributors into the set as well. You know, I guess you always come out of these things knowing what you should have done. Should have done better.
Yeah, and I think that's always going to be the an issue if you're an artist, is that you're always going to think about, oh, we could have just added, just sprinkled a bit more of this here, a bit more of that there. But I still, the idea, like, so you see one of the contributors throw Lego at the brick at the wall, and even getting like a sense of idea of like that is the force that something was thrown at, and we were there thinking, oh, it could have been someone, but because we're all looking in one area, it wasn't.
Yeah, yeah. It's a very convincing account he gives there. Yeah,
It's just like, wow, okay, so you becomes more believable about what's happening, that actually this could be happening. You kind of becomes more believable that it's not just a family member that's seeing that. But on top of the sort of the recreations of the sets, you also had actors that came in to play roles of their real life counterparts. When it came to directing the actors, was it difficult to sort of get them to gauge that they'll be lip syncing to a tape rather than performing creating performance from scratch?
yeah. I mean, lip sync was part of our casting process. Even, you know, the first thing we asked people to do was we gave them a bit of tape, and you know, we were doing kind of Zoom auditions at that time. So I think it was during COVID, and to lip sync. So their skills at lip sync were important, I think. I suppose with performance, you know, if you're lip syncing an existing bit of audio, you're taking away an actor's one of the key things in an actor's tools in an actor's toolkit, which is how they deliver a line. You know, and I think that really changes the way performance works, because you're sort of deducing the character from the sound. You know, you're deducing what they might have done, been, looked like, etc. from the audio. One of the actors said to me that for her, she had to kind of approach it like a traditional piece of performance, like, you know, get a script, learn it, and then, you know, loop the audio and listen to it and listen to it until she got that. And she found that to get that, what she needed to understand was how the character breathed. You know, and once you'd got the way that character in the archival tape was breathing, it became much easier to hit the lip sync. And certainly, you know, having had this idea that we would lip sync the audio, because it's not just lip syncing of interviews, it's lip syncing of actuality when people are not finishing their sentences or talking over each other or leaving long pauses, you know, which was particularly difficult for people. I think it was a much more complicated process than we thought we were taking on. You know, we only had like a week's rehearsal, I think, across the whole thing. So very much I was dependent on actors preparing well, which they all did brilliantly. And then we would find things out from the tapes, often that we hadn't thought of, particularly once an actor had started working with it. So that when we were, you know, blocking a scene, you'd kind of realize that, oh no, that those footsteps go from there to there, and they couldn't possibly move from there to there in this time. Or, you know, it was almost like the tapes. There are certain constraints that the tapes put on the way the scene was shot, and the way the movement happened in the scene. So it was really, you know, I say sometimes it's a bit like. And one of the effects we were trying to get was a sense of the actors haunted by these tapes, haunted by these actual tapes. But in a way, I think we were kind of all haunted by them, because it's so much constrained and determined what we did.
I think that's another interesting point as well, that you had the idea of how you'd be blocking a scene and then actually it'd be impossible for them to go to that from point A to B when it's actually B to A. And it was probably one of those sort of frustrating moments of like, oh, we have to sort of start from again just to sort of get them over there. But also the little like nuances that people would have, like as you said, the pauses or the not finishing of sentences. I can imagine that sometimes would drive an actor sort of crazy, thinking, I'm about to hit that point, but you didn't, you went a second too early, for example.
Yeah, we evolved this kind of complicated set of beeps where we'd put a beep into the tape recording like exactly a second before they started speaking. So if you had something which had a 7-second pause in it, say, second 6, you get this beep, and the actors just got very good at judging that 1 second. So for lip sync, you needed them to be accurate to, I don't know, within 1/10 of a second, I say. You can jiggle it around a bit, but if you're doing that more than 2 or 3 frames, it starts to create all kinds of knock-on problems across the piece. So yeah, but it's amazing what they did, really.
Yeah, and as a normal audience member, you'd think lip sync can be quite simple because you have you have the audio, you probably have some sort of transcript as well in terms of having a script. So you just need to sort of read about, sort of just read back what's there. But then it's the pacing, nuances, the way that they might be breathing, the way that they might be reacting to what's happening. Sometimes these recordings are happening, the dead of night. So you're going to sound a lot more tired than you would be, for example, if it was at midday. So there's always those little things that need to sort of build on as well into the performance.
Yeah, absolutely. And the recordings weren't necessarily, Morris wasn't the most brilliant sound recordist. He would sort of leave the tape recorder, in one corner of the room when things were happening, in the other corner, obviously, because he couldn't predict what was going on. But and I like that about it, that in a way the audio gives you weird perspectives on the scene, things you would never use in a drama, but that in a way kind of keeps reminding you that these are real tapes. But yeah, tricky for the actors.
Yeah, and hats off to them for being able to put it off, and it's translated really well onto the screen. We were talking about this before we started recording, but we were talking about there's so there's 200 hours of recordings, and for something like this, I understand that you went through all the 200 hours, which probably was an extremely daunting task. But how many times did you go through the tapes? And did you start making, how did you choose what you wanted to put in the documentary to what you didn't want to put in? There's obviously probably some sort of filler during evenings and nights where nothing's happening, or it's a case of just a recording's just been left on the whole time and there's just no sound, not no sound, but there's no sound being made in terms of poltergeist or movement.
So we went through a process where, I mean, myself and my producer, I think, probably listened to them all once, and then a team actually of people that went through and transcribed them as well. So we had that, we ended up with a kind of searchable transcript, which was fantastically useful. And in terms of selection, I guess there were 2 things I was looking for, really. One was, the something that would give you the escalation of these events, would give you the kind of shape of each episode. Poltergeist events have been reported since Roman times, and they seem to follow a similar pattern, where they often start with knocks and furniture moving and then become more dramatic with people being thrown around or voices. And whether that's because of some consistent pattern in the human brain, or whether that's because there's a force that we don't know about, I think the series leaves open. But I did want to get to that escalation. And there's a lot of repetition in the tape, so you're kind of selecting for, and also I think because, as you say, it's a well-known story. There are certain iconic moments that everyone knows about. The moment where the lollipop lady in the street reports seeing Janet levitating, or a fire seeming to be a fireplace, parts of a fireplace being thrown across a room. So we knew we wanted to hit those kind of what you might call iconic events, and then to kind of fill them into this escalation, which would also give you a sense of the family. And then the other key thing for us was about the sort of psychological development of the series, and looking in the tapes to find scenes that kind of built that. And made you understand the relationship that starts to develop between Morris and the family he's investigating, and gave you hints of his own story, which becomes important in episode 4. So, and also I think scenes that would sometimes, sometimes we use scenes that push you into disbelief. There are times when the kid's accused of faking, and I think as an audience, you think at that moment they're playing around. I think Morris would have said, "Yeah, but just because they're playing around doesn't mean they're always playing around." And so kind of moving an audience through kind of states of belief and disbelief. I guess one of the interesting things to me in releasing it is that maybe audiences do that less than I thought they would. As in, if you come to it with a very strong belief in the paranormal, you'll kind of go away with an even stronger belief in the paranormal. If you come to it with skepticism, you'll go away with skepticism, and you might go on a journey from beginning to end of that where you sway between those two. But people will be looking for the things that support, particularly those that really vehemently support either end of that spectrum, are sort of looking for things that support that.
Yeah, and I guess when you're going through, you mentioning about picking out using the iconic moments and then building the other parts from there. It's kind of like when you're talking about it as well, it kind of makes you think as well, like how terrifying it must have been for people like the lollipop lady who had seen Janet levitating and being like, it's sometimes you kind of like, I don't even know how I'd react in that sort of situation. It's probably more like you'd be like, holy crap, I can't believe this is actually happening right in front of me. But then when you're sorry to go on a tangent on there, but then when you're then sort of building up from there, I guess it's a very good way of sort of, that the end point at a certain that there's certain things that are being escalated, and then as a storyteller you can show how it was slowly built up to that sort of point, and then sort of build up that this was not just sort of a one-off, this was a constant occurrence. There's certain things that went bang crash in the night.
Yeah, I mean, there is a sheer quantity of stuff going on, definitely, and I think in some ways that's what the case has most got going for it. It's just the sheer quantity of material. I should say that one of the ways we developed this was we did it. The first thing we did was an audio cut. Having decided to do lip sync, you're down a path where you have to be incredibly planned. It's the opposite of making a normal documentary, which, as I've got older, I get less and less planned. I'm much more trying to just be really open to the situation we're shooting in and kind of work within what that situation is throwing up. Whereas this, because of the lip sync, is like every word's kind of nailed down from the beginning. So we did this audio cut of 4 episodes. And what was interesting in that was what we tended to find in the shoot was obviously the ways in which, images mean you don't need audio. So often for example, in the audio cut, what would really work would be a lot of Morris's tape idents. He'd go, "Oh, we're in the sitting room and it's Tuesday the 4th of December, and there's Mrs. Hodgson and Peggy and Janet and Margaret and Mr. Burkham in the room." And obviously as soon as you in an image, you can convey that in one image in a second. So I think what we found ourselves doing obviously was just obviously paring away that audio cut that we'd done, to sort of do obviously more storytelling through pictures.
Yeah, and I guess with audio, a lot more needs to be described to audience members. It's like when you listen to football on the radio and the commentators have to do so much heavy lifting to describe what's happening on the pitch, but then also keep on top of the constant movement rather than watching it live on TV.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. That's exactly the difference. Yeah.
But I'm curious to know as well, like as a filmmaker and when you go into documentaries, do you ever feel that there's some sort of moral responsibility for your subjects? Because sometimes I get I'm not. Sometimes people can forget about the real life impact it has on people. And as you said as well, like it went from a story of a poltergeist to then a complete circus at the house, and as someone you mentioned as well, like when you think about your times in like adolescence and with Janet being so young, it must have really shaped her sort of growing up as from a child to an adult, because it was such a sort of like a horrible time, but then also the sort of media circus that followed. As like a director, what sort of how do you go about like creating a sort of moral standpoint and making sure that people aren't exploited just for entertainment?
Yeah, I mean, I think that documentaries kind of inherently an an ethical or unethical or unethical activity. You know, it's an activity where you have to talk about ethics, and you have to talk. You know, I think as a director, you are responsible for the consequences of your documentary, even if those are sometimes unintended. You know, you can't really control the way the media pick up on something, the wider sort of press media, but you do have a responsibility because in a way you've brought that on someone. You know, so there are two kinds of impacts, I guess, that or three kinds of impacts. You know, there's the impacts of, in this case, the events themselves, which, as you say, are really shaping on the lives of those two girls. There's the impacts of actually filming with them about it, and how you do that in a way that is you know, consensual and careful and sensitive to them. And there's an impact on them just by you exploring this story at all, because it's going to plunge them, you know, into a period of time, maybe short period of time around the release, but a period of time of like intense interest on an area of their lives which you know, they may have moved on from, or or may not want to go back to. So it feels to me you always have to embark on these projects with as a sort of partnership with the key people they're about, you know, and in a way documentaries are based on those partnerships and those relationships. And you can tell, I think, a documentary that isn't. And I think one of the sort of disturbing things about modern, you know, documentary now is that it feels to me that there's a progressive kind of parting of the ways between that responsibility and what ends up on screen. You know, if you're talking about the detail of the way something is edited, for example, you know, series often use edit producers. An edit producer hasn't been on the shoot, so doesn't know the contributor, and the director might not be in the edit. You know, the edit producer might be hired to do the edit. That feels to me like a really unethical separation of the relationship with the contributor with what is actually made, because it often in the edit I'm kind of going, no, you know, we can't spin that way because that is not what she thinks, or we can't do that because that's going to have this impact on her, or she didn't want me to go near that thing, or, you know, all of those sorts of things. And all of those are constraints on the story, but they're really important constraints, I think. And I think the danger is, you know, always in documentary you're navigating the difference between a story and reality. You know, a story is not reality. A story is how we make sense of reality. But our stories have to be true to reality, in the sense of, I think you have to be guided by an ethic of truth telling and an ethic of respect for the people who are telling those stories and for whose stories they are. So yeah, I think it's really hard to get right, and I'm not sure you ever get it right. But I think it's a critical part of filmmaking, of documentary filmmaking.
Yeah, because it says people's lives, and even though it's been turned into uh, entertainment in a way, but there's still a way that you still want to be like, well, no, this has to be as respectful to what's happened to people, because this is you kind of want to shed new light on it to people who might not know about the events, but then also to show that like there is so much to it as well.
I mean, it's complicated because I think you also have to not be completely captured by the by the by the contributor as well, in a sense. You know, you have to have a kind of, you've got an obligation to the audience to be truthful, and you've got an obligation to the contributor to be respectful of their story. That doesn't necessarily mean you're only going to give your contributor's view of the story. You know, you might set that in other contexts, but you're going to take them through that process in a way they understand what you're doing.
Yeah, exactly. Just to get to my penultimate question, you intercut with what's happening on the tapes with also interviews with people who are involved, if it's reporters and family members. And I think the cousin, that was the first time he sat down and spoke to people about it on screen, which is something that I'm quite surprised about because I would have thought people would be flocking to sort of get him to talk about his experiences. But I think at the same time, I think he summed it up best was when he was there, he had that really, that really bad feeling in the pit of his stomach that something was wrong. And I guess when you are involved in trauma for such, traumatic events at such a young age, I don't think you really want to bring it up. But as the director of the doc itself, how do you onboard people who haven't spoken about the incidents? Then how do you also go about making them feel comfortable when they start being interviewed once the camera's rolling?
I think it's I like to do a lot of research on these things. I try to read everything from the time about it, the newspaper articles, the things people have written, and then and books. I'll read very widely around something. So for this, I read stuff about quantum physics. I read stuff by skeptics. I read stuff by spiritualists. So kind of a real by psychologists, but a huge range. And then as you start to talk to people involved, obviously you get a real sense and knowledge of the story. And I think that's the first thing that helps build a relationship, that people get that you do actually understand the story. You haven't just read like one newspaper article about it and then you're going to come and talk to them about it. I think that's important. And in terms of interviews, I mean, I see interviews much more as sort of conversations than as, it's not like I go into an interview with 10 questions and here's number one and here's number two. I try and basically find a route through the conversation that will kind of reach the points that I want to reach, but respond to what the person is saying at the time. And my interviews are very long. Each of those interviews for all of those people were 1 to 2 hours, and mostly 2 hours actually, and then sometimes more than one interview. So and probably if you looked at their interview time in the actual piece, it's probably 5 minutes. So first of all, there's a lot of selection going on, but there's also a lot of like just allowing people time and allowing time to unfold, and not be too driven by what you think you want, and actually sort of look at what the person's got to contribute and wants to say, and find your starting point from that.
It's interesting to hear about the interview that you'll be sitting down for 2 hours and then only 5 minutes could be used, which again, like hats off to you and your editor to be able to find the most important things and place them into the documentary itself. But on top of that, is what like getting someone comfortable enough to go through the motions again and have those conversations, even if it could be the 50th time or the first time. And you probably have a mixture of questions that you've prepared, but also want to be free flowing as well to make sure that you can follow up on what people have said and what's more like sort of listening and gathering in and taking in what they say at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's right. You sort of, I mean, I actually, as I've got older, I actually don't really have a list of questions. I've got like a sort of a set of paths. I do this kind of mind mappy thing, and I just have that as a way of prompting myself, knowing that it would be great at some point in this hour if we talk about this, but let's find the right moment to talk about it. So there are definitely areas of the story that I want to cover with people. I try not to let that drive it unless we're sort of going in that direction. I think that's and be just asking very open questions. Usually my question is usually tell me about tell me about this, tell me about that, and it's very, very broad. So I guess it's very different from like a Newsnight interview or something where you're really trying to get someone, because it's live, to say something pithy and headline grabbing in the next 20 seconds.
Yeah, you have the thing that's going to get the clicks for people getting what they have to say. But with that longer form, it's just more, as you said, you've mind mapped it, which I think is a really interesting insight into how you work. Um, because you, it, if you're, you do 1 to 10 questions, it can be very regimental and very stiff. But I guess if you have like a mind map, you'd be like, well, if they say if they want to answer this, then we can go here. If they don't,
Yeah,
we can go here,
exactly. Yeah,
and
yeah,
then you can fill up this whole sort of wall of ideas of like, okay, we know where we need to go, we know what we want. Let's go ahead and start talking about it and let the magic flow.
Yeah, it means the crew get very bored, but do one thing.
I do wonder though if crew get lost in what's being said sometimes in terms of so on a normal film on a film for example people could be lost in a performance where somebody could be quite funny so you don't want to laugh because of you ruin the take or sometimes people you've heard stories of like people had a performance and crew have been weeping about how good it is. So I wonder if crew on documentaries like if crew kind of get lost in what somebody's saying but
Yeah,
recount their
definitely,
feelings as
definitely.
well.
I mean, definitely. I would work with the same sound recorders. Lighting camera or DOP and camera assistant. Usually it's like that kind of configuration of crew, fairly pretty small for interviews. And I would try and work with the same people throughout all of the interviews of a project, hopefully you get to a point where they're as interested in this story that's being told as I am. And definitely you have those moments where all the crew are kind of gobsmacked by what someone's saying or very moved by it, and you kind of know that those are the things that are going to perhaps really play in the film itself.
Mm. I know I said that was my penultimate question, but there's one question that popped up in my mind that I would love to ask if it's possible. Once you've shot everything and have an idea of how the episodes play out, was there any point in the edit where you thought certain things weren't working, or you had shot something, or the story slightly changed, so you had to sort of rework what you shot, or a tidbit in an interview that somebody might have said?
Yeah, I mean, I guess to a certain extent we were sort of locked in with the scenes that we'd shot, but we absolutely kind of shortened them at times, dropped a couple of scenes that we'd shot because they just weren't working. And it wasn't that they weren't working in the way we'd shot them; it was just that narratively they weren't the right place to go. They sort of took you down the wrong path, or they didn't set something up adequately. So and then you've got this kind of freer area, which in this was the witnesses coming back into the house or doing interviews with us, and that's like a mass of material, sort of, I don't know, 20 hours of material probably, which then you can work out how to place, and you haven't really decided in advance how to place. Or I guess you have got a sense of, you've asked them around certain areas, but exactly what you use is much more of a sort of free. You've got a much freer hand. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, the edit. I don't know. Having done that, I think it was sort of between 4 and 6 weeks on each episode as an audio cut. We then were in I think it was like a 14-week edit of each episode, and certainly during that time, there's a lot of refining and throwing out and reordering and cutting down.
Mm. And I can imagine that there's in that sort of time as well where you could be playing around with like maybe if we just tweak something here and tweak something there, and especially with like documentaries where you you've said as well like you probably have how something's structured, but if something's just in terms of like interviews could be changed or taken out, and on top of that things that might have been added to a situation, so you could have a recording of something that's happening and then cutting it to someone who was there and being like, wow, actually scared me crap, it absolutely scared me that this had happened, and then we're experiencing this at this moment in time.
Mm.
Or like
Or
with
the opposite, yeah. I mean,
yeah.
like in a way, I think that one of the difficulties with drama documentaries, well, I don't even know if this is a drama documentary. I sort of think it's a documentary that uses kind of lip sync, but there's definitely a different way an audience perceives perceives it. In fiction, in drama, an audience is kind of suspending their disbelief, and in documentary they're kind of exercising their disbelief all the time. They're going like, is this real? How real is this? Or all those, is this true? And those two things sit quite uneasily beside each other, and if you're cutting from one to the other, sometimes you're snapping an audience out of an immersion in something or an emotional feeling about something. And so so absolutely, that's a judgment I think you can, well, for me, is one that you tend to make in the edit. And so that thing that we thought would work there doesn't really work, but if we put it next to this, it'll work. So in the end, it's this crazy, is every frame in the right place thing. There's that level of detail, and you'll be going through and taking out for a frame here, a frame there. But to begin with, obviously you're structuring it, and then gradually it just becomes a more and more detailed process.
I think as the post side of it all as well is quite interesting as you're building it up, and locking each episode in, especially when it's 4 parts. There's probably a lot to sort of take in to say, actually, this happens in part 4, but then in part 1 we have this part, so there must be some sort of link there as well. Or if something like even a passing comment might sort of trigger something to be changed around.
Yeah, I mean, it felt really important to me not to lock picture, as in get to the point where you can't make any more decisions editorially before we to lock them all at the same time. Or within a couple of weeks of each other, rather than, and that's frustrating from a production side, because you want to lock episode 1 and let's get it off to post and get the sound crew working on the sound post crew working and visual, the graphic effects stuff going. But fortunately on this, we were able to hold that moment until we were, until everything was in place, which I think makes it a more coherent piece. Otherwise you would be doing things, you go, oh, I wish we'd set, now we know that we're doing that in episode 4, I wish we'd set that up in episode 1, and we were able to do that, which was great.
No, that's good to hear as well, having that a little bit more creative freedom to build it all up. Even though it's 4 parts, it probably felt like a one long film as well.
Yeah, exactly. And me being someone that didn't have documentary series and not where my experience is, I've done 8 feature docs, and that's I really understand the shape of a feature doc, and I sort of treated this like a one long, very long film, and was sort of learning the series skills on the hoof, and they are really different. I learned an awful lot about what happens when you deal with this kind of quantity of material and of story, and in some ways it's a very different beast from making a feature doc.
I can imagine that there's just a lot to think about as well, going into the edit, but also shooting. So just to sort of move on to my last question, what was your favorite scene to work on?
Oh, that's an interesting one. There's a scene in episode 3 where the scene before, they've been visited by a ventriloquist who's been sent by the Daily Mirror to kind of basically say that the voice that keeps appearing is ventriloquism on behalf of the young girls, and the ventriloquist has claimed that the girls confessed to him that they were making up the voice, making the voice themselves. And so it's a critical scene for Morris, our investigator, because he's suddenly faced with like national exposure of this thing he's been investigating as is it a scam? And that was just a really, I like that scene for loads of reasons. One, because of all the different dynamics going on in it. There's a way in which Morris, wants to kind of get the girls to publicly retract that confession. It's possible that confession was forced out of them. There's a kind of, you can sense a relationship going on between the girls in the room that makes you uncertain about all of those things. So I think an audience doesn't quite know where to put themselves in that, which I think is good. And the lip sync from all of the actors in that scene is just incredible, because it's a scene where people are talking over each other and not finishing sentences and pausing, and and it's they did just the most amazing job.
Solid choice, and on top of like sort of a turning point in the investigation, but also the reenactment where you're saying where people are speaking over one another. That must have been timed really well, basically like a dance between the recording and how everybody's reacting to it. I just think as well, like there's so much that goes on in this case, and it's kind of hard to think about. Like, you kind of think about certain scenes and you think, I wonder why people have done that, and then you kind of, once you find out more, you're probably like, well, they probably confessed to that just so that people could leave them alone, and then they don't, because as kids you don't know the repercussions of what's going on. It then becomes a bit sort of overblown, and then it's like, oh.
Yeah, absolutely.
Jerry, thank you so much for your time today. The Enfield Poltergeist is streaming now on Apple TV. If you haven't seen it, I know we probably spoiled it all, but there's a spoiler warning before this episode. Plus, it's based on real life of a case from many years ago, decades even. But go out, watch Jerry's work, and enjoy it.
Thanks, Robert.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your time, and you take care.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast.